Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Mr. K is Wrong, where I look at the Facebook memes shared by somebody named Mr. K, and I basically debunk his right wing bullcrap. Now, he's somebody that I used to know back in my high school days, and, he just has a bunch of ideas that are wrong in his head. And this meme here that I'm going to discuss today, it really reveals the big contradiction in MAGA populism, or at least one of the big contradictions. And it kind of suggests that he doesn't even know exactly what he believes. And, I know politics can be complicated. Perhaps you could say none of us really know exactly what we believe. And, okay, maybe there's something to that general statement. But nevertheless, the contradictions in right wing ideology are pretty severe at times. And with the meme that he shared on Facebook, it says this: I wonder how the government acquired the earth and why we have to pay them to live on it. So again, the meme says, I wonder how the government acquired the earth and why we have to pay them to live on it. So this meme strikes a surprisingly anti statist posture that sounds radically populist on the surface. However, when shared from a conservative MAGA Republican perspective, it really contains some massive historical, economic, and political contradictions that frankly suggest he really does not understand his own ideology or the history of conservatism or right wing politics or any of that stuff. So, what exactly am I saying here? Well, there is a core contradiction. Well, there are many core contradictions of the meme. So, let's look at contradiction A, attributing land ownership to the government instead of capitalist private property rights. So the government is involved in capitalist private property rights, although technically the concept of a government is bigger than private property. So remember the claim: the meme implies that the government owns all the earth and charges citizens rent or taxes to exist on it. So, what is the reality of that claim? Well, the vast majority of land that people pay to live on, to mortgages, rent, or land purchases, is privately owned, not government owned. The concept of exclusive private land ownership is guarded and enforced by contract law and property rights, the bedrock of, guess what? American capitalism, which MAGA and conservative politics will strongly champion. So the irony is pretty strong. You actually aren't paying the government to live on Earth, at least not by itself. You are paying private landlords, banks, and property developers. The government simply maintains the registry of titles and legal system that allows those private entities to kick you off the land if you don't pay them. So that is the actual answer for how the government acquired the earth and why you have to pay them to live on it, at least in a lot of cases. So, the populist messaging here, it's a little contradictory. So let's look at contradiction B: disliking paying the government versus enforcing property rights. When citizens pay property taxes, they're funding local infrastructure like roads, sewage, emergency services, and schools. And those give the land value in the first place, other than, just having some land. More importantly, conservative ideology relies heavily on the police power of the state to protect private property rights. The police and the state will protect private property rights against things like trespassing, squatting, or public seizure. So the meme complains about government interference while relying entirely on government force to validate land ownership claims. So let's look at one of the historical paradoxes here that unfolds because of the meme. Let's look at the enclosure acts. So those are something you rarely ever hear about, and that's because their very nature would actually be controversial. It's one of those things that people will rarely hear about, precisely because the uh, the reality of what happened is a massive contradiction, and it's bad for business, so to speak. So, to understand how land was actually acquired and turned into something that people have to pay for, you have to look at history, specifically events like the British Enclosure Acts between the 17th and 19th centuries. So, what were the Enclosure Acts that you rarely ever hear about? And in fact, it seems like I'm one of the few places that mentions these, kind of regularly on my podcast or on my blog. I will sometimes mention them. But anyway, for centuries under European feudalism, common land, also known as the commons, existed where peasants could freely graze livestock, forage, farm, and live without owning the title to the land. But through thousands of parliamentary acts, the British government forcibly privatized, fenced off, and redistributed these public commons to some wealthy private landowners. So this exposes the meme's flaws if you really think about it. And yeah, I guess you don't really have to think about it that much. It's sort of right there on the surface. The state created private property. The Enclosure Acts are a textbook example of the government using its authority to remove land from the public domain and hand it over to wealthy private individuals. So there was a forced monetization of existence, in other words. Once the commons were enclosed, ordinary people could no longer survive on shared natural resources. They were forced into wage labor in cities or forced to pay rent to private landlords. And how does this work with MAGA? What's the MAGA alignment here? Well, the Enclosure Acts represent the exact mechanism of privatizing public wealth for individual commercial gain, a process heavily favored by so called free market conservative ideology. So, again, if you think about the meme's basic argument or question, I wonder how the government acquired the earth and why we have to pay them to live on it. Well, the, that all happened because of right leaning ideology. This wasn't a bunch of leftists who created things like the Enclosure Acts and who decided to give public commons to wealthy private landowners. That was a right wing or conservative idea. So let's look at how MAGA and modern Republicans support government acquisition and privatization of land. While the meme questions how the government gets the right to control or dictate land use, conservative political platforms frequently rely on and expand government authority over land in some key ways, in several key ways, really. For starters, there's the Native American land seizure called Manifest Destiny, and you also have things like eminent domain. Historically, the US government acquired the earth, to borrow the meme's language, by seizing ancestral lands from indigenous nations through military force, broken treaties, and through state power generally. Modern conservative platforms rarely question the legitimacy of these historic government land grabs. Rather, they aggressively defend the resulting private property titles and state borders, and in a number of cases, actively mock the indigenous nations in question. You can find plenty of people like Kirsty Nome who have been at odds with the indigenous people, and that was to the extent that they actually barred her from uh, being on their land or whatever, in their territory. So, right wing conservatives have been pushing to privatize public lands and, in fact, to privatize the government in general. Public lands like national parks, uh, BLM land. I don't mean Black Lives Matter land, but the Bureau of Land management land, and national forests, they are the closest modern equivalent to the commons, land held in trust by the government for all citizens to use freely. But Republican Party platforms regularly advocate for selling off federal public lands to private corporations for things like mining, oil drilling, oil drilling, logging. I mixed up the word drilling and logging there. Uh, but anyway, oil drilling, logging, or real estate development. So again, Mr. K, when he shared that meme, it's like he doesn't even understand his own ideology. So the contradiction, it's just plain as day. By pushing to transfer public land into these private hands, conservatives are actively supporting the modern equivalent of enclosure. Once public land becomes private, then everyday citizens lose free access and they are forced to pay these private owners to use it. And of course, right wingers will also defend the creation of border walls and the land seizures through eminent domain that so often would happen if you were to construct something like a border wall. To build border walls, a core MAGA policy, mind you, the federal government routinely uses eminent domain to forcibly seize private ranch and farmland along the U.S. Mexico border for their own border wall construction, and this would be seizing it from private American citizens. Here, government acquisition of land is directly endorsed and celebrated by the MAGA platform. So Mr. K, again, he just doesn't know what he believes. He's contradicting himself. He acts like he's sort of an anti government person, yet his own ideology is utterly dependent on the government. It actually doesn't seriously question, some core government concepts like citizenship or, the the military or the police or anything like that. In other words, he's kind of a wuss, you know. Now, when I say to question something, I don't necessarily mean you should necessarily abolish everything, But if you have a sort of fiercely independent ability to question institutions, well, you don't shy away just because it's like the police or the military. You don't uh, have fear of questioning things like private property. You question these things because, well, you have a brain in the first place, and also because these are common institutions. What are the things you should question the most if you're interested in having, relevant discussions and debates and all that kind of stuff? Well, you question the most common things around you, and also if you are kind of interested in maybe improving society, you look at both the good and the bad of the institutions that are surrounding you, and you might arrive at certain conclusions that are not necessarily popular. So, you might call the critiques of capitalism socialism or whatnot. I'm personally not that interested in labels. I think they're historically relevant and they can help define movements or whatever. But when it comes down to it, you can criticize, the institutions around you, not because you've read Karl Marx or uh, because a political party encourages you to do so, but just because you have a brain. All right. And that's kind of what you're supposed to use your brain for. Although, unfortunately, it can, under certain circumstances, be dangerous to question certain things and to do so in certain ways. And people like Mr. K and his right wing movement are exactly the same types of people who would make it dangerous to publicly criticize institutions. Ironically, they consider themselves free speech, you know, uh, professionals or whatever. Like they're free speech absolutists, and they will talk about how much they love freedom and all that kind of stuff. And in the Republican platform, but those are just like bumper sticker slogans. If you really value freedom and you have some actual policy critiques, well, you will most certainly contradict a lot of these Republican uh, policy agendas, and that's the reality of it. So the meme relies on a populist, pseudo-libertarian sentiment that appeals to anger over taxes and housing costs. However, it completely misdiagnoses the cause. So the reason people have to pay to live on Earth, as the meme says, is not simply because a tyrannical government owns the land, but because a legal system of privatized property rights, historically built on government land seizures like the Enclosure Acts, and vigorously defended by conservative politics, makes access to natural resources conditional on private wealth. So there you go. That's the actual answer to that question. And, the fact that people don't understand that is pretty amazing. Anyway, hopefully you enjoy this episode. Maybe you learned a thing or two. I don't know. I certainly know that the enclosure acts are not very often discussed nowadays, even though I think they are relevant all these years later. But anyway, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Share the episode with people, and you know, I think it provides some food for thought.